Welcome back to the Mina Show featuring Lenny, the only NFL podcast where one of the host's favorite Commanders receiver is Jahan Dotson, because it sounds like Dachshund. That's Lenny. He's actually a little bit part Dachshund. I'm Mina Kimes. We are not talking about the NFC East this week. That'll be next week. We are beginning our series of division previews by talking about the AFC East. And I am so happy to be joined, I believe, for the second time, because I think you helped me preview this division last year, if I remember correctly, Taylor Kiles of CLNS Media, who covers the Patriots. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm excited. Always a pleasure.
Taylor, I'm so pleased to have you on, always, but I'm really excited to talk about the Patriots because I think it's been a very interesting camp for the Patriots thus far. It's been a very interesting offseason program. We have a legitimate quarterback battle that I want to get into with you. I think it's definitely one where, with that team in particular, I really wanted to talk to someone who's been there and has seen all of the new pieces, the new coaching staff, because there's just so much change in Foxborough. And yeah, I'm really, really excited to get into that. We're going to do the Patriots at the end, but I had you on. We did a show on YouTube, which, by the way, you can also watch this podcast on YouTube, talking about the end of the Bill Belichick era. I guess I just want to ask you really quickly before we dive into these team previews. What is the vibe like in New England right now?
I think with the players and everyone in the Patriots building, everyone's pretty rejuvenated. Now, there's clearly a lot of love for Bill Belichick during Tom Brady's Hall of Fame enshrinement for the Patriots Hall of Fame. Bill Belichick had an insane round of applause, like standing ovation for multiple minutes. I think the nation obviously still has a lot of love for him, but there were also things that needed to change. I think we've seen it throughout the league where younger coaches who can connect with players, also guys who have a playing background, are really starting to kind of gain prominence in these coaching circles. And with Gerard Mayo, he's a guy that, one, players have respect for because of the legacy that he has in New England as a player. And then he came back to coach, did a great job. The Patriots defense is one of the best in the league every single year, and he's had a big hand in that. So I think all the players were excited to finally see him. I think during the season they were saying that they were looking forward to him getting his opportunity. Had head coaching interviews elsewhere. Finally got to get to that rank of head coach. Really cool to see somebody spend their entire career also with one organization, but it seems like everyone's really fired up. And just to see also the offense have a true fresh start, really not a lot of holdovers, that's been pretty big. So the vibes are good.
We're going to dive into that offense shortly, but I wanted to start with a different team, the New York Jets, who are actually currently, at least according to the lines I saw on ESPN Bet, the second favorite to win the division after the Buffalo Bills, which kind of surprised me. I thought the Dolphins would come in above them. But the more I chewed it over, the more it made sense because, you're looking at the high upside case where everybody's healthy. That is, of course, the giant caveat that comes with this Jets team. Yes, if Aaron Rodgers, Tyron Smith, and Mike Williams in particular, those three are healthy and play an entire season, which has not been the case, then I think it's almost become like such a routine thing to say that we haven't really interrogated it. This idea, like, if those guys are healthy, this team is a Super Bowl contender. But let's actually interrogate it and get into it. Let's talk about the offense first, because I talked about the defense at length for my top 10 defenses pod, unsurprisingly, I'm sure to you. I actually had 3 of these 4 defenses in the top 10 again. So we're very high in the Jets defense. There's not really that much to talk about with the Jets defense, to be honest. We can get into it. The offense, to me, is more intriguing because we're really sort of back where we were last year, where we're looking at a Nathaniel Hackett coordinated, Aaron Rodgers-led offense, the biggest difference being that they have bolstered the offensive line and added Mike Williams. So let's just start there. If everybody's healthy, if Rodgers comes back and he's fine, he's been, when he's been there, by all accounts, he looks fine. Do you believe that this has the capacity to be a top 10 offense with that, assumption that everybody's playing?
I definitely think they have the potential. Now, Aaron Rodgers, being the age he is, coming off the injury that he suffered, I do think you kind of have to temper expectations to a degree, because I think it's unfair to just expect him to be MVP Aaron Rodgers, just in all realism. But at the same time, like you said, they did bolster the offensive line, which was the biggest part. They stole a couple guys from the Ravens. I love that they got Olu Fashanu. Thought that was huge because we've seen that Tyron Smith is a great player, obviously. No one's questioning that, but not someone you expect to play a whole lot of games for you necessarily. So even if Olu doesn't start, the fact that he can wait in the wings and kind of come in for either Tyron Smith or maybe even Morgan Moses if something happens there, I think that's huge for the protection for this Jets team and the run blocking. I think that really the game plan for this team is to be a heavy running team. We saw it. They got Braylon Allen and they got Isaiah Davis in the draft to back up, obviously, Breece Hall, who's a stud. But you can see in that wide zone duo scheme, they just want to pound the rock and be the aggressor. And I think that'll help Aaron Rodgers so everything's not on his plate. Kind of talk about that with a couple other teams in the AFC East. And that's where you get to the receivers, where, okay, if you can be an effective running team, Garrett Wilson's going to eat. And we saw pretty quickly he and Aaron Rodgers had a really good relationship. And in these Rodgers offenses, chemistry is huge because he wants somebody that he can trust to be able to literally just look at him and they can change the play pre-snap. That's so big. But that's where things get a little more complicated because with Mike Williams, I feel like he's kind of like a house of cards kind of player where you take him out, things kind of fall apart because he's the only true X on this team. Garrett Wilson can be that guy, but I think he's better as a Z. And then in the slot, I really do like what they can maybe get from Malachi Corley. I think he maybe isn't just that gadget guy. I think he can maybe be a true route runner, but that might take time. But yeah, other than him, I'm kind of curious what they would do if something happened to Mike Williams because I don't love the depth they have there. But if the offensive line holds up, I think that'll be huge, whether it's Rodgers, if God forbid something happens to him. Tyrod Taylor's a very good backup. So, I think it could be a very good offense. Again, if everyone's healthy, top 10 for sure. But it's just those asterisks. They're kind of impossible to avoid.
Yeah, it's when I did the X Factors pod for the AFC with Greg Rosenthal, we actually chose Mike Williams and not Tyron Smith as the X Factor because the offensive line does have some depth because of the draft pick. And when you look at this receiver room, it's Williams, Wilson, Williams. You could argue he's probably going to get more targets than Corley. And then, Alan Lazard is back. Wasn't great last year. Xavier Gibson. You're right. It's not a thin group. It's not a particularly strong tight end group. Kyler Conklin, Jeremy Rucker, they're fine. I'm just saying it's not. You do the clearly best case scenario. I know this sounds like an obvious statement, though, is Wilson and Williams playing together. And after I talked with Greg, I was thinking about just like Williams and Keenan Allen and the various ways they were used in with the Chargers and how much better that offense looked when the two of them were ever on the field, which is obviously all too rare, but when they were on the field at the same time because they were really complementary players. And I do think Mike Williams and Garrett Wilson are similarly complementary. Wilson will play less in the slot than Allen did, although he plays in the slot some. But I think, as you said, he is best as that Z receiver, and the idea of him and Williams and their ability to dictate and get the best possible matchups with those two on the same field at the same time is it's tremendous, right? But yeah, he has to play, and he obviously, Mike Williams is coming back from another major injury, so we have to see how he looks as well. The run game, to me, I totally agree with you. I think this is an offense that is going to want to run the ball a great deal, and Breece Hall was an absolute hell last year. I mean, the whole Jets offense was an absolute hell. But I looked up his. This is why, I love next gen stats for running backs because rushing statistics can be so misleading because it's so dependent on multiple things: run blocking, how often you're facing loaded boxes, that kind of thing. Obviously, nobody really feared this Jets offense through the air last year, and they also couldn't block the run. In fact, NGS there's expected yards per carry based on blocking and whatnot, and Breece had an expected yards per carry of 3.8, which was 40th amongst high volume running backs. He exceeded that and actually ended up 5th in yards over expected per carry because he's awesome. But it was a really, 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 really bad situation for him. And one thinks, again, with those two receivers in particular on the field, that things will really open up for the run game as well.
For sure. Because again, it starts with the offensive line. If they can dictate and they can be the aggressors, where, especially defensive linemen can't pin their ears back and just tee off on Rodgers, that's the worst case scenario. That's what you really don't want. In the NFL, those things are going to happen, of course. But to some degree, with Rodgers' ability to get the ball out, you can work around it. But if this offensive line stays healthy, Breece Hall can eat. And I know I cover the Patriots, but selfishly, I'd like to see Breece Hall. I mean, I did the last game that the Pats and Jets played. Wasn't great if you were a Patriots fan, but that kind of gave you a little glimpse at how good he can be when the blocking is actually successful. So, yeah, it's going to be really dependent on that group because I think we know what Breece Hall can do. Also, as a receiver, I don't want to discount him as just a rusher. He also can make some plays when he's catching passes. So, yeah, I mean, the Breece Hall effect is real, but if you can give him that extra help where they're actually creating their own lanes and he can do his own work, I think that's where you look at this team and say, yeah, they are a top 10 offense because they're not putting everything on Rodgers' lap.
The thing I don't love about the offense, and again, even just starting from we're assuming everyone's healthy. So starting there, and we're saying this is if everybody's healthy, this could be a top 10 offense. Rodgers, it's more than just health for him. I think we want to see what he looks like. But I just don't love that they kept Nathaniel Hackett. And there were reports, I think it was Connor Hughes at SNY, who reported that they considered replacing him, which yeah, they should have. But obviously, the relationship with Rodgers is has taken precedent there, or it's why he is the offensive coordinator of the Jets. Rodgers has said if you trust me, trust Hackett. I feel like we're kind of looking at this and we're saying, well, it's Aaron Rodgers. He's basically running the offense, but I don't think that's. It certainly matters when you're talking about a veteran Hall of Fame quarterback and all of that. But if we're really arguing that this team has not only the potential to win the AFC East, but to make a deep playoff run, if everyone is healthy, the play calling is going to matter. Hackett, I feel like, I certainly last year, obviously he was saddled with bad quarterback play, but even so, even with the limitations at quarterback, I did not feel like he had a good sense of run pass balance, sequencing play. It didn't feel like he was getting even the most out of the players that they did have. Do you disagree? I mean, are you worried about Hackett coming back?
Oh, absolutely. Now, whenever I hear offensive coordinator Nathaniel Hackett, it's like offensive coordinator because we all know, again, Aaron Rodgers runs the show. Now, I don't love the fact that he's back even if Rodgers is healthy because I think we saw with like a Matt LaFleur, he still was able to, even though there was some contentious, a relationship between those guys, he still pushed Rodgers and made him a better player. Like he may not like it because he's older and he's had so much success, but also having another ear who does push back against you can make you better. And I don't think Nathaniel Hackett's going to give that to Rodgers. And if something does happen to him, again, Tyrod Taylor is a really good backup, but like you said, is he going to be able to do what Tyrod Taylor does best? Can he support him? And that's the part where it gets a little murky, especially if, God forbid, Jordan Travis has to step in. That's the guy where you really need to protect him because he's a young player. He's got a lot of deficiencies. Like, I hope he has a successful career. I personally just didn't love the tape. And if Nathaniel Hackett is calling plays for that guy, I just don't have a whole lot of confidence. So I think it would have been great if they had someone who could bring, a little more structure to the offense outside of just what Rodgers wants to do. But at the same time, as someone who follows the Patriots and covers the Patriots, I'm not mad at it, and that should tell Jets fans all they need to know. Nathaniel Hackett was like, "Cool, he's staying. That's fantastic."
So defensively, I kind of mentioned this, but my assumption is this is still going to be one of the best defenses in the NFL. Looking at the depth chart, it's largely the same. Taylor, right? While it is hard to sustain elite defensive play year to year, I feel like when you look at this group, they're young, they're fairly deep. If I had question marks, obviously safety, which I talked about when I talked about the top defenses. And then, the pass rush, there is change here. You bring in Hassan Reddick, who is, I think, still in Japan, but I assume he's going to play. You want to see more out of Will McDonald. They've got youth on that defensive line, but it's still deep. It's still really strong on the interior, obviously led by Quinn and Williams. I guess I just don't have significant concerns looking at this group that they're not going to be as awesome as they were next year, especially, of course, when they're not saddled with one of the worst offenses in the NFL. Do you agree? Do you view them as a top three? We had them second, by the way, overall. a top 2-3 unit? And I guess how do you regard this group overall as in terms of like how it stacks up compared to the rest of the NFL?
Yeah, this is one of the most boring position groups to talk or sides of the ball to talk about for any team because you know they're going to be good. And there's been so much continuity. It's not like there's this fresh new angle. Like, yeah, they basically swapped Bryce Huff for Hassan Reddick, but everyone else is largely the same. Like the guys who are dictating and the guys that you fear are still there. Quentin Williams obviously is the tone setter in that group. But then they've got waves of defensive linemen they can throw at you, which is what you want from the best defensive lines. You want in the fourth quarter to have a pass rusher out there who's only played like 10, 15 snaps and has some kind of rhythm versus an offensive lineman who's gassed. And then that second level is one of the fastest, most intelligent, and really most intimidating units in the league, obviously, with Quincy Williams and CJ Mosley. Those guys are gangbusters. And then Sam McGuavin, who's also a really good depth piece and really good third linebacker. No one uses space, but, if you got to rotate or do what you got to do, he's a really good piece in that regard. And then cornerbacks, I don't think there's a better trio in the NFL. So I think Chuck Clark is also, with that safety position, that's definitely a guy who I think can give you better play than maybe what they had last year as long as he can return to form and get healthy. But yeah, I mean, it's boring. They're good. They're very good. Yes, they are a top 3 defense as long as everybody stays healthy. One of the, again, most intimidating units because of the way they're coached, the way they play, and the fact that they can have that kind of, we're going to kick your attitude because they have the players to back it up.
I was gonna argue that Quincy Williams is like this one of the most underrated players in the NFL, but I forgot that he was, I think, a second team All Pro or,
Was it?
yeah. I when I was looking it up because I was like, oh, nobody gives Quincy Williams the respect. He's so good. We think of him as like the brother, and it's funny because nepotism's a hot topic right now. He was first team All Pro. Woo, buddy.
Ooh, there you go. All right. Give him some love.
Deserved. I have to go look and see who I voted for. I definitely voted for him. I don't remember if it was first or second team, but
Lead the charge. Well done.
you know what really impressed me about him last year, Taylor, is like I thought of him as being like very, very good against the run. He's a very good tackler, but I think he's gotten so good in coverage. And when we did the top 10 defenses pod, we talked about how the Niners, Jets, Texans tree of sorts, the play they get out of their linebackers and particularly in coverage. And it's not easy. It's one of the hardest things to do in this iteration of the NFL is to cover as an off-ball linebacker for all of the reasons we talk about. And Williams, not only was it an eye test thing, I just looked it up. He actually ranked first in the NFL in coverage success rate amongst all linebackers, which is the percentage of targets when you're the nearest defender that result in a successful play, meaning negative EPA. He had 10 passes defended, which was the second behind only Fred Warner. I mean, he was, it's, like him and Quinnen, man, like that is, I think we need to start thinking of them as like when we talk about like the great siblings of the NFL, because he is really, really good.
Super Smash Bros in the trenches. Mama must be proud. And no, I remember watching the film when I was similar. I kind of always think of Quincy Williams as more of a run stopper because he's so terrifying coming downhill. When I was studying for the Jets, when the Patriots were going to play him, I'm looking and seeing him, how fast he diagnoses screens, the fact that they would try to pick him off and he's going over the picks and making plays. That's where you really start going like, okay, this dude's different. Because it's one thing when corners or safeties are recognizing that stuff. You don't see it that often from linebackers. And then in their, they play a lot of zone, obviously, and he's so great at getting to his depth and he has really good awareness. But when they play man coverage in those more obvious passing downs, it's really hard to fool him. And he has the athleticism where if he's a tick ahead, then you're probably not going to complete it on him. So I 100% agree. I'm glad he got the recognition because that dude's a baller.
Yeah, finish this sentence. Let's wrap here. If the New York Jets defense does take a step back, it will be because ...
Because Quinnen gets hurt. Honestly, he's just such a game wrecker. Like they have waves, but he's just on another level. And they're so deep, it's really hard. Like I'm not really sure.
No, but I think you're right because there is no star edge on this team. Right. We've got a lot of really good pass rushers, and that adds up. This defensive front, as so often is the case with these coaches, the sum is greater than the parts, but Quinnen is the superstar. Right. I would say the same as with Sauce. The trio is really good, but it's not a super deep group of corners. And if you take Sauce out of that equation, I think you could run into trouble. But again,
You like
that's
Stiggers, though, I'll say. I do like Quintez Stiggers. He was someone, I know the Patriots kind of worked him out. He's got a really interesting career arc. Definitely look it up if you're not familiar. He's had quite a path to the NFL. He's not sauce. I'm not saying that, but I do think he's someone who could be a role player in some capacity. He's a long guy, really fits their scheme well. But agree.
Let's do the Dolphins next, and let's talk about their defense first, because I feel like this has gotten a little bit lost this offseason, or not lost, but I certainly haven't really gotten to it. And it really struck me when I was looking at this group. A lot of change, led, of course, by the coaching change. They have a new defensive coordinator, Anthony Weaver, coming over from Baltimore, which suggests there's going to be a scheme change. And last year it was Vic Fangio. I thought they actually played pretty well, but by all accounts, there was a lot of friction between him and some of the players, Jalen Ramsey. This seems to be a better marriage, at least thus early. We'll see. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what that might look like. So just to give people kind of the lay of the land, Christian Wilkins is gone. You got Sealer, Tart, and now Calais Campbell, who can still play, by the way. Anyone who watched the Falcons last year. And then Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb, question marks when they're returning. Chubb tore his ACL at the very end of the year. Phillips was Achilles, week 12, very serious injuries. So they brought in Shaq Barrett. They drafted Chop Robinson, clearly aware of the injury, the dubious timelines at edge. Linebacker group, they added to bringing in Jordan Brooks, signing I loved, from Seattle to play next to David Long Jr. And then corner, Xavier Howard is out. You bring in Kendall Fuller. Cam Smith is still there as a rookie. And then safety, again, more change here. You still got Javon Holland. You bring in Jordan Poyer from Buffalo. So I felt like it was necessary to do the depth chart there, because unlike the Jets, this is a very different defense led by a new defensive coach.
Yeah. And they did have some pretty crucial losses. Christian Wilkins, the fact they brought in Calais Campbell does make me feel better. I really like Zach Sealer, but even still, I was like, all right, well, Wilkins is a pretty huge loss. As much as I like him, can he be the guy? So I do like Calais kind of going into that role and still being someone who can eat space, make plays, and do all of that. I would say still a downgrade, but not the gaping hole it was before. Andrew Van Ginkel has been one of my favorite Dolphins players. He's an absolute monster. The versatility he gives you. He's a pass rusher. He's a run defender, can play on and off the ball, drop into coverage, all that stuff. Didn't really replace him necessarily, but I do like the volume approach they took where you got Shaq Barrett. Like you said, they drafted a couple guys. So I do expect a little bit of a drop off with the pass rush, but at the same time, I understand them not bringing back Christian Wilkins. It was just so much money for a guy who is getting up there in age. Like, going to the Raiders, I mean, not that they're, I don't think, going to be a contender anytime soon, but if they got money to spend and they want to put it on their defense where all the talent's at, then sure, that makes a lot of sense there. I do think they upgraded at linebacker, though. I really, really like Jordan Brooks over Jerome Baker. Jerome Baker's a solid player, but Jordan Brooks, I think, is one of the better linebackers, especially in coverage in the NFL. So I thought that was a good move. I also like them moving on from X. He's had some really good years, but I think we saw last season, kind of in the past couple seasons, kind of on the decline. And I do think that you get a little more consistency from Kendall Fuller, a guy who's versatile. And also that secondary, this is the biggest thing I think with Anthony Weaver. He'll let these guys move around. I think the best thing you could do for opposing offenses is put Jalen Ramsey in one place. This is a guy who's shown he can beat you up on the outside or inside. And I think playing more of a match style of coverage where, again, Kendall Fuller can move around. Kader Kohu, I think, really is more of a slot guy, but I guess based on the matchup, you can kind of move him around as well. I think that's going to add a layer of complexity to this defense they didn't really have, and it's going to make them much more intimidating because you can't just say, we're going to put this guy opposite Jalen Ramsey and try to – you're not going to pick on Kendall Fuller necessarily, but I think the fact they can more dictate on the back end is going to be a really big area of improvement for this defense.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the assumption is it'll be interesting to see with all these Ravens coaches across the NFL now. It's is the scheme going to be similar to Baltimore? What are the similarities? Will we see the Dolphins use more simulated pressures? And then, as you said, on the back end, will we see a lot of movement? Jalen Ramsey, is somebody who has I think about in Los Angeles where he played the star position. He has that versatility, and he's an incredible tackler. He's incredible on the ball. He's so physical. I actually thought he was better last year in coverage than the year before, if I am thinking. So I think he could still cover at a really high level, even as he gets a little bit older. But I think there's potential there. Again, when you think about the similarities to Baltimore, unlocking some of these players in the secondary. Javon Holland is someone who I'm eyeing as potentially thriving in this scheme. But, we got to see it. I am very curious to see the thing that Baltimore did so well last year, and I don't want to take it for granted. I certainly don't when I think about even Mike McDonald coming to Seattle, is their ability to get pass rush from seemingly everybody and without blitzing, of course. And so you look at this team, and you're like, okay, well, maybe, Phillips and Chubb are out, but can Anthony Weaver similarly get, gin up a very successful pass rush like they did in Baltimore? I don't know. Honestly, that's something I'll be very curious to see in Miami, in Tennessee, in LA. Well, LA, they have 2 elite pass rushers, but in Seattle, like it's going to be really, really interesting. I'm optimistic. I do think there's still good players on this team, but I wouldn't be surprised if they don't look as good in the beginning of the season because of the injuries at edge in particular. This is a group, because of the change in coordinator, because of the injuries at edge, might look better at the end of the year than they do at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think especially with creeper pressures, I think they have the personnel to really thrive in that area. Kader Kohu's a really physical slot corner. If you want to put Jalen Ramsey in the slot, we know Jalen Ramsey can do whatever Jalen Ramsey wants. I know Javon Holland is more of a back-end kind of guy, but he's a pretty effective blitzer as well. Then David Long and Jordan Brooks, they're really athletic guys who can insert into the pass rush if you want. And then in the front, you got Sealer, you got Campbell, you got Taylor Tart. Those guys can eat up space and kind of open things up in the middle, depending on where you want to bring it from. Just to clarify, Creeper and Sims, they can be kind of confusing. Creeper is just when you're sending 4 rushers or fewer, but one of them is unconventional, where it's like an off-ball linebacker or a defensive back. And then Sim pressure is when it looks like you're going to blitz, but you back out, and then it's kind of hard for the offensive line to tell where it's coming from. So being able to do that and get in people's heads, and especially the way that they do it in that Mike McDonald scheme where the communication is so fluid. It's kind of like in Earnhardt Perkins, where you have one word like Ghost for the Patriots, where it just tells you the concept and tells everyone based on where they are what to do. With McDonald, it's one word and you know what kind of blitz you're bringing, and everyone can be on the same page. And the ability to play fast and really be the one dictating what's going on, that's going to be huge. And again, there's so much physicality and speed on this defense. If they do have to find a way to get some pressure without the aid of Jalen Phillips and Bradley Chubb, that's probably how they're going to get it done.
Yeah, the Mike McDonald defense in some ways is kind of like the inverse of the Niners offense, the sort of basketball on grass, where it's not like you don't play positions. The position tags don't matter. Your responsibilities matter is
Right,
kind of
exactly.
very layman's term.
It was football.
And I keep saying this, but the other thing to remember is like that Mike McDonald defense against I was talking to Ryan Clark about this, against Miami looked awful at first. Might take a second for all of these defenses across the NFL. We'll see. It can take some time, but I'm interested in seeing that. Offensively, not as much change. Offensive line is where there's the most change. You bring in Aaron Brewer, to play center. That's a big change in particular. You're changing guard. Robert Hunt's gone. I believe, Wynn is going to play inside. And then you've got Armstead and Jackson at tackles. They bring in Odell Beckham Jr. as wide receiver 3. They add Jonnu Smith as a tight end who can hopefully get them some yards after the catch. And then they draft Jalen Wright, which is a very on-the-nose draft pick, speedy running back. I hate to always approach the Dolphins conversation from did they fix the problems that seem to crop up at the end of the year, cold weather, whatever. But I do feel like you kind of have to start from that point, because if we are talking about a team with Super Bowl aspirations, and I think this team should have those aspirations based on what an absolute wagon this offense was for much of the regular season, it's a problem that they have to solve. So let me ask you that, Taylor, as a way of getting into this offense. Do you feel like the additions will help them overcome some of the issues we saw crop up at the end of the year?
It's kind of complicated because one, I think that part of the issue the Dolphins have faced is they just haven't had a whole lot of depth. Where it's like if Tyreek or Jalen Waddle goes down, you kind of just key in on one person. And even with the running backs, like Raheem Mostert was on another level, obviously, but Achane, as effective as he was, when he went down in the backfield, looked kind of slight. I really like the fact that you have OBJ now, where you can't, even if you want to say we're going to take out Tyreek Hill, we're going to take out Jalen Waddle, OBJ doesn't have to be the guy that he used to be, but he just has to be good enough where he can beat their third best guy. And then Jalen Wright adds that to the backfield. Even Patrick Paul, Teron Armstead, kind of like Tyron Smith, one of the best players at his position in history, but not someone you expect to stay on the field. You probably don't want Patrick Paul starting right away, but if he has to go into the lineup, he's better than a lot of the other options they've had. Now, I say all that to say, I think what they did in terms of building out the offense, I really like. Like, Robert Hunt is a huge loss. I don't really think they fix that part of the team. Robert Jones, I don't really know what they're going to get out of him necessarily, but it all kind of comes down to Tua at the end of the day. And I have a lot of respect for Tua, but the fact that the Dolphins are hesitant to pay him, I think kind of tells you how they feel, because as much as we want to talk about like he slimmed down, so maybe he can extend plays more and, be more of a running threat or more of an off-schedule threat and all that. But his arm is his arm. And it kind of is what it is at this point. In bad weather, you want a quarterback who can consistently throw tight spirals to cut through wind, bad weather, get the ball where it needs to be, or also someone who can just consistently take advantage of those downfield windows that are going to come up when you have, this offense put together. But I just think at this point, Tua kind of is what he is. And at the end of the day, when you get into those really tight games, when you're playing Mahomes, when you're playing Josh Allen, the fact that he's so dependent on a specific style where he needs to, hit that back foot, get the ball out, and there's not as much wiggle room as there is for other top quarterbacks. If you're in a 2-minute drill against a really good defense, that's going to bite you in the butt. Like at some point, you're going to kind of empty the empty the clip. There it is. And defenses have a pretty good idea of how you're going to attack them and what you want to do. And a smart defense is going to kind of sit on where they think he's going to throw the ball, and then you jump it. And that deficiency is something that plus the arm strength, I just don't know how you overcome that if you have to play 3 or 4 good defenses in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think what they're hoping for, and I think this is the correct approach, is the way you overcome those late in the down struggles. Like Tua, when he has under 2.5 seconds to throw, which is his average as well in there, that's how this offense operates. Numbers are astronomical, top 3 in just about every metric. EPA per dropback 0.23, which is very, very high. And then as soon as it goes over 2.5 seconds, that drops to about the middle of the pack, and then it drops just longer in the down. So to over 2.5 seconds, by the way, it drops from 0.23 to 0.05. So I feel like, as you said, like he is not the guy who is going to whip it downfield with 3.5 seconds and make those high degree of difficulty throws consistently. I'm just saying. However, I think what he can do better, and something I'm very curious to see this year, is extend a little bit. That's not about arm strength. That's mobility, pressure feel, speed, all that. And what they can do to help him is get you guys who can work underneath and get you yards after the catch, because you have such unbelievable speed. There's always room. There's always grass. So if it's an OBJ or a Jonnu Smith on the backside, or someone who's just like, or Devon Achane, who I saw somewhere is working out with the receivers. They're trying to incorporate him more into the passing game too. It's so important for this offense to have a third option, whoever it is. I think for that exact reason, because I think you can compensate or at least address some of the issues that they've had structurally with this quarterback that way.
I mean, look at Tom Brady. That's why he and James White were thick as thieves, because, for a guy who can't really extend the play like Brady, where it's not conventional, where it's not killing you with your legs like a Lamar Jackson or like a Pat Mahomes or Josh Allen, where you extend and then throw it downfield, you do need those guys underneath who can make some magic. And like you said, Achane is that kind of guy. Obviously has crazy speed. If you leave him underneath with a bunch of cushion because you drop back to cover other guys, you're in trouble. Jonnu Smith is in that same category.
Yes.
OBJ, especially off schedule, he's so good at finding space and getting open. If Tua can find a way to kind of navigate the pocket, and the fact that he's slimmed down should be huge for that, because one thing looking at Tua when he's kind of throwing on the move, it just looked stiff for a long time, where he's not getting the kind of rotation where he could throw accurately, because it felt like he was putting so much on it. Now it feels like maybe he can get some more of that rotation. The accuracy should improve on paper. We'll definitely see, but that's a great point. If they can get some underneath guys who, can just be that outlet to make the tough plays once the defense is kind of flooded the deeper part of the field, that would be huge for this offense.
And I do want to make a point for anyone who's listening to this and defending Tua in their car. A lot of that drop off with time to throw is because of the offensive line. It's not just because of Tua's arm strength or mobility, or we're talking about that, but like the offensive line is perpetrator number one for the massive drop off. Tua's quick release, I have been very consistent on that, hides the offensive line deficiencies and has hidden them for years now. But we're talking about, okay, well, what do you do? Because they did not really improve this offensive line. That is just something that they have not prioritized, much to my frustration, frankly, at times from a team building perspective. I think it's kind of like how teams with dual threat quarterbacks used to say, okay, we don't have to invest that much in the offensive line because we have a dual threat guy. There are various points in the NFL I can point to. Obviously, Seattle, is one that comes to mind with young Russell Wilson. I almost feel like Miami, because of Tua's quick release in the scheme, like they kind of take it for granted or something from a team building perspective. They're like, we don't need, stud interior offensive linemen because we've got this guy who gets rid of the ball so quickly. And I'm going to tell you, it comes back to bite them in moments like the ones we're talking about.
Exactly. And when you look at the interior, Isaiah Wynn did play well for them when he was in the lineup. This is a guy who's been consistently hurt throughout his career, so you can't even expect him to be in the lineup. And then again, you lost Robert Hunt and didn't really replace him. And this isn't, this is a quarterback who has an injury history. I don't understand it either, the lack of investment in the interior. A guy like Tua can maybe get away with, decent tackle play, because as long as you don't get beat inside, push them around the pocket, you can survive and step up. But if he gets quick interior pressure, even if he can scramble and everything, that's not a place that you want to live in, because it's just not where he thrives. There's nothing wrong with that. You want to play to his strengths. So I agree. It's kind of baffling. Again, as someone who covers the Patriots, I'm not mad at it, but also as someone who respects and likes Tua as a person, I would like them to, care about his longevity and his health. And it's pretty baffling. Aaron Brewer, I guess, but it's also because you lost Connor Williams. It's not like you necessarily upgraded. It feels more like a swap there to me. So it's baffling, and we'll see how it plays out for him, because the interior depth, it does not look great.
All right, let's take a quick break, come back, and let's get to those New England Patriots. Why should you bet with Caesars Sportsbook? 2 words, Caesars Rewards. Every bet brings you closer to the types of benefits only Caesars can offer: hotel stays, VIP experiences, sports and concert tickets, and more. It's not just an app, it's an empire. All right, Taylor. So this is your account. Let's start with the offense. And really, I feel like I just have to start by asking you this question. Based on everything you've seen this summer, is Drake May going to start week 1? What is the feel right now? I know you don't have, obviously it's not a sure thing either way, but where do things seem to be trending? And what did you see from this young quarterback who, of course, New England took 3rd overall?
So Jacoby Brissett right now is the projected starter, which makes sense. He's been in Alex Van Pelt's offense before. The offense looks smooth with him out there because he has a familiarity with the system. He knows what he's supposed to do. He keeps everything on schedule. And he's still a good quarterback, especially for a bridge. Not only could you do worse, I think he's actually pretty solid. We saw that when he was in Cleveland. Deshaun Watson went in there, and there was a pretty significant drop-off. So nothing bad if Drake May doesn't start. However, I do think Drake May is showing signs of, if he makes some big strides in this summer break, I would not be surprised at all if he starts. And I was saying that during draft season. I didn't really understand the idea that he needed to have a Jordan Love experience where he sits a whole year. Now, obviously, we've seen it work for guys like Patrick Mahomes and, Lamar Jackson to a degree, and Jordan Love. These guys did get to sit to start their careers, and then were gangbusters by the time they hit the field. But I think Drake May's processing is pretty underrated. The biggest thing you worry about with him is the accuracy, specifically underneath. And there were times where that's where that he doesn't have the job quite yet, where some of those short throws are behind his receivers. That leads to breakups, makes it harder on guys, and you want more consistency in the footwork. That's another thing where you don't want to throw him out there because you want him to make sure he has good habits before you kind of throw him to the wolves. But he was also making like no-look passes. He's pumping underneath defenders and then throwing behind guys to get them open, not like intentionally. Just the things he does where you can tell it's natural are astounding. And that's on top of, they didn't throw deep a whole lot during these practices, but when he did, it's like, yep, that looks different. As someone who was at camp when it's Bailey Zappi and Mac Jones, we're dealing with a very different situation with Jacoby and with Drake May. And then even on the last day of minicamp, like honestly, it was kind of tough that inaccuracy underneath started to pop up. But in the red zone, things clicked. He had some beautiful passes to Kayshon Boutte, to Jalen Polk. And you can see this isn't somebody who gets rattled. Like he will still come back if he has a rough day and make the plays he needs to make. And I really think the ceiling with this offense is going to obviously be significantly higher. He was a first-round pick. But I have a feeling when we get deep into training camp, the defense is going to start to look at this guy like, okay, we love Jacoby, but we need this guy on the field. Like he's doing something to defend. So yeah, Jacoby Brissett is the guy right now. Do not be surprised if Drake May takes the job. He jumped Bailey Zappi almost immediately.
Yeah.
Bailey Zappi was the second quarterback when they started in OTAs. After 2 days, it was Drake May's job. And that, I mean, that's pretty obvious, I think, as an outside perspective, but it at least shows that he's doing what he needs to behind the scenes to jump someone who's been in the league for multiple years.
Second question for you. So Alex Van Pelt is now the offensive coordinator. Comes from Cleveland, is with Green Bay. The assumption is the offense is going to have similar DNA to what we've seen in Cleveland. Under center, wide zone, boot, play action. Pardon me. Is that, do you think a correct assumption? And if so, how do you think that scheme shift fits with May and the personnel?
So Ramondre Stevenson and the players have mentioned a lot of the outside zone, wide zone type scheme. They keep mentioning the Cleveland offense, so I think it's going to be pretty similar to that, which makes a lot of sense. The Browns had a lot of success with that system. Now, it's interesting because the Patriots have a lot of maulers on the offensive line. Like you look at City So, David Andrews, Mike Nwenu, Caden Wallace, who is a good athlete. It's a lot of guys who are really better at displacing guys vertically than horizontally. So I think they can still live in that wide zone world to a degree as like a top 2-3 concept if they rep it a lot, which they are doing. Like it's so dependent on chemistry. I think that could maybe make up for the fact that they just have a lot of bigger guys who aren't quite as agile as long as they can pass off and things like that. But with Drake May, you do want to be able to move the pocket because he is so athletic. He can make crazy throws off platform where, you can give him a bootleg, and whereas Mac Jones is probably throwing the shallow every time, Drake May will throw the deep post like 40 yards downfield, and you have to account for everything. So I think Drake May is the kind of guy where he even said that when he was visiting New England, he watched Aaron Rodgers and Green Bay tape, even though they're installing a Cleveland offense, which kind of tells me they do think he can unlock every level and do pretty much anything you ask of him schematically. It's really going to depend more for me on how this Patriots offensive line executes those moving pocket style of plays, because I really think where they should live is more in the duo, power, long trap, that kind of world, more so than really moving horizontally. But, we'll see.
But, by the way, I mean, I say Cleveland wide zone boot, but the Cleveland run game has evolved. And last year, you certainly saw a lot of pulling action, the different concepts from, I think, what we've associated. And that reflects, of course, broader trends in the NFL with some of these offenses. I guess you bring me to my biggest concern about this offense. So the group of skill players, it's like a lot of twos, a lot of interesting receivers. Polk, who we talked about ahead of the draft, player I like a lot. Bourne, who I think is consistently underrated. Demario Douglas, who I saw Drake May compared him to Josh Downs, which got me piqued my interest. Javon Baker, they drafted this year. Osborne, Smith-Schuster. It's not great. I'm not going to pretend that that's one of the better skill groups in the NFL. But my take is this. I'm less worried about that group than I am about the offensive line, because I look at that group and I think, okay, there's no obvious stud. We'll see what happens with Polk and Baker, who are, rookies. But I still think there's competent players. There's the interesting skill sets. It's going to be kind of about fitting them together the right way. Whereas I look at this offensive line, and you talked about sort of the run game and potentially mismatch between personnel and scheme and what kind of they arrive at there. I don't know why it didn't occur to me that a Okorafor starting at left tackle. I don't love it, dude. I don't. And Nwenu, is he gonna? I mean, he should be inside, but he might have to play outside. Maybe Kalen Wallace, rookie, will play. It's not a great group, at least on paper. And maybe you can disabuse me of that notion. But when I think about this offense and what could stop it from at least improving on what we saw last year, which should be the expectation, that's the position group that jumps out to me as a concern.
Yeah, it's just a group with so many unknowns. Like there are bright spots where Scott Peters is now leading the room. It's I think he's the fourth position coach that room has had in 4 years, but he also learned from one of the best offensive line coaches in history, in Bill Callahan. So that gives you some optimism. He's a guy who everybody kind of raves about his coaching style, how specific he is. When you look at the personnel, David Andrews, rock solid. Mike Nwenu, he actually was at right guard towards the end of minicamp, and then you had Caden Wallace at right tackle. That's a group that I like. Like that right side, I think has some really solid potential because Nwenu, he's an okay tackle. He has the chance to be an elite guard.
He's a very good guard, yeah.
As long as you use him the right way. If you're not asking him to, if you ask him to go downhill and move somebody, put a defensive lineman in a linebacker's lap, he is fantastic. So that right side, I think, is something you can be optimistic about. The left side is kind of scary because Chuks Okorafor played left tackle in college, but never did it in the NFL. And he is a very aggressive pass protector where he likes to get on guys really quickly, which is a double-edged sword because sometimes it works in your favor and you shut down Nick Bosa immediately and he's not an issue. And then there's times where guys anticipate it and they beat him across his face inside and it looks really, really bad. Those immediate losses you just can't have. You're hoping Scott Peters he's still an athletic guy. Like when you see him out there, he doesn't look like any of the Patriots' other linemen. He's like a jumbo tight end. So you're hoping Scott Peters can work with the physical tools he has and mitigate some of that. But still, huge question mark. Another big question mark is Sidy Sow. He was PFF's highest graded rookie offensive lineman as a run blocker. And you saw that. Like he and Mike Nwenu were getting crazy movement on their double teams. Also with David Andrews, like that was a really good duo. He did play left guard in college. That's where he's at now. And again, you hope that as a run blocker, he'll be at least really good for you. But then as a pass protector, he had some issues. Pressure rate was not acceptable for someone going into their second season if it were to continue that way. So you're hoping as a young player who did show promise, he had some really good games, was solid against Daron Payne. You're hoping you see more of that this season. So that's the kind of the righter end of the spectrum. But again, that left side has some very real question marks. And we're going to see once the pads come on. Again, we just got through minicamp and OTAs. You're not learning a whole lot other than lineup situations. But it's on paper, there's reason to have some, skepticism, if not pessimism, about how this group's going to come together.
Last question about the offense. I listed all the receivers. I should add, Hunter Henry and Austin Hooper's a decent group of couple tight ends too. But those receivers right now, if you had to predict which of those receivers we're talking about at the end of the season as like having a breakout year based on what you've seen so far, who would you point to?
Demario Douglas. He's been fantastic in camp. Like he stands out as the guy who's always open. And when he's not open, he's making the catches when guys are still on top of him. Last season, due to coaching situation, all that stuff, he couldn't really play as well as I think he showed on tape, where there were times where the routes weren't great because I think that was more of a behind the scenes thing. If a rookie's having trouble running routes and everyone else is too, you're probably not going to blame that one player. But you were also seeing, again, some of the NFL's best slot corners. He was getting open. He was making plays. And that was as a rookie. And again, it seems like he's building on that. He looks a little bit bigger. He's a really good route runner, might be their best separator. He's good after the catch. I think he's not a burner necessarily, but I think he can be a 3-level threat. And because Drake May compared him to Josh Downs, that was something I kind of had thought about before he mentioned it, which gave me a little bit of validation there because he and Josh Downs were gangbusters because Drake May can put the ball wherever he wants when he's on. And the fact that he can do that with Demario Douglas, who is a smaller guy, but can also make tough catches and separate as well. He can do a little bit of everything. I think that's going to be a really good connection. And someone, especially as a slot receiver, where you can just feed those guys targets. I really struggle to think that anybody's going to outperform Pop based on what we saw early on this spring.
That would certainly be like an optimal outcome to get that sort of production, that sort of relationship we saw between May and Downs. All right, defense. I talked about this defense already. We don't have to get as much into this unit because they were in my top 10 defenses pod, and I think I had them higher than a lot of folks potentially. I think I had them fifth, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
And that was, you know, really a bet on the fact that like this was a defense that continued to perform at a high level despite being unbelievably injured and saddled with a non-functional offense. Um, that returns pretty much everyone and then gets back Matt Judon and Christian Gonzalez. Obviously, the big elephant in the room is the loss of the greatest defensive coach in the history of football. So I guess that's what I want to ask you about. Not so much the personnel, because I've already gotten into the personnel and it's mostly familiar faces. Coaching wise, like what's that feel for that? I don't know what hand Gerard Mayo. I know that they are promoted or hired a defensive coordinator. It's Covington, right? Or
Promoted Covington, yep. Mhm.
yeah. So I guess I want to hear your thoughts on like the hand that Mayo has had in this defense under Belichick. Obviously, he was hired to be the head coach based on that, so it must be good. And then how you view this coaching staff moving forward.
So not only did they lose Bill Belichick, they also lost Steve Belichick, which was
Yeah.
pretty big. Steve and Gerard Mayo have really been co-defensive coordinators, where I believe Steve did a lot of the more behind-the-scenes stuff, and Gerard was the one who really led the room. So I think that Gerard is also going to be less involved in the defense because he's a head coach. I think he wants to, be a little bit involved in everything. But DeMarcus Covington is someone who is getting head coaching interviews. He's been with this team for a long time. He knows not just that he was a defensive line coach, which has been one of the best units on their team for a long time. So
Yeah.
I'm optimistic about him. The safeties have said, no, you don't get it twisted. He understands what's going on front to back. Like, this is not a guy who was just on the defensive line. So that knowledge of the defense, the fact that they're aware of the fact that the pass rush wasn't great. Obviously, losing Judon had a lot to do with that. Also, Daniel Aquale, kind of an underrated guy. But there was that. They need to get more turnovers. Again, losing Gonzalez, losing Judon, that's going to happen. But I think he wants to be more aggressive. Christian Barmore kind of let slip that they're using more four down fronts, which with the personnel that they have,
Hmm.
Joshua Uche has acknowledged that they're going to play more to his strengths, which to me says you're going to be a little bit more aggressive. That's exciting. I think they have enough guys who, like, aggressiveness can obviously be a double-edged sword, but they have so many veterans who are disciplined and understand the balance that you have to kind of play when you are attacking. And they blitzed a ton last season. It's not like they weren't aggressive,
That's
but
right.
I really think they take a step forward with the personnel. So they also got Jerry Montgomery to replace DeMarcus Covington as defensive line coach. He was someone who survived multiple regime changes with the Packers, has had a ton of respect there. All the defensive linemen here have raved about him. Christian Barmore has said that he's helped him elevate his game, which should be very scary for anyone going up against Christian Barmore. But really, other than that, they have solid continuity. They brought in Drew Wilkins as other outside linebackers coach to replace Steve Belichick. He's a guy who's worked under Wink Martindale, had spent time with the Giants, also with the Ravens. So, he brings a little kind of fresh perspective to that room. And then you still have Mike Pellegrino, cornerbacks coach, I think is one of the most underrated position coaches. Patriots went through 9 different cornerbacks last season and were still very respectable on the back end. And then Brian Belichick is still with the safeties. So there's a lot of continuity. The changes that they made are guys who seem like they would still fit really well, have a lot of experience and a wealth of knowledge. So Belichick gives you an edge. I feel like it's, if you're at 100%, Belichick puts you at 110, 120% because he just brings so much knowledge that you don't have. But Gerard
Yeah.
Mayo, even though he isn't going to be running the defense, is probably still going to have final say. So he played under Belichick, was a captain under Belichick, and ran his defense, then ran his defense as a coach. I feel like really there's a better chance that they evolve as a unit rather than take a step back, which I feel like a lot of people have been saying might happen.
Yeah, I feel like Belichick, you know, um, the absence might be felt against elite quarterbacks in big games that call for bespoke game plans and creative approaches and whatnot. I will see that is something he was amazing at. But I think on like a down to down basis, I expect this defense to be better than they were last year, because last year they were excellent against the run, but they struggled a bit against the pass, particularly getting to the quarterback. And for me, that was a lot of that had to do obviously with personnel. So yeah, I'm curious to see what both Keon White and Marty Mapu look like this year, second year, as well as Gonzalez coming off of the injury. But I just think looking at this depth chart, it's just still so solid. Taylor. It's just still such a solid group. I maybe corner opposite Gonzalez, Jonathan Jones. See, that might be a bit of a question mark.
Mhm.
But otherwise, I don't really see any obvious holes on this roster.
Yeah, Alex Austin is someone who has been getting a lot of opportunities there. Had that interception last year against Josh Allen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was crazy. Showed one, the intelligence, the recognition, but also the fact that he finished. He's been getting opportunities opposite Christian Gonzalez, a guy that I'm really high on. Also, kind of competing with Marco Wilson, a veteran who just has had a lot of time in the league. And with Pellegrino, I feel like he's really good at taking guys who just played ball and making sure that they just aren't liabilities at the very least and put them in position to make plays. So, yeah, for sure. That third cornerback spot's up for grabs, but also Isaiah Bolden, freak athlete who played under Deion Sanders when he was in college, a guy who's been in the slot, but Gerard Mayo said he sees him as more of a perimeter kind of guy. He's got the height, weight, speed kind of combination that they really like in their later round picks. He's gotten a lot of opportunities. But yeah, at every level, I mean, the starters, it feels like there's at least a quality starter at every other spot. And then they have depth behind them as well, where you can kind of send out different guys. Obviously, they love sending out different packages where people have certain roles. And you mentioned Keon White and Marte Mapu. Those are guys who I think are going to involve into real playmakers, not just guys who can take on snaps, but like Marte Mapu's baiting Patrick Mahomes in interceptions and ripping the ball away, and Keon White splitting double teams and, just wrecking backfields. So it's a really deep unit. I feel like they have some top 5 potential. Again, if those young guys can take a step forward and they manage to take a step forward also as a group with so much continuity.
All right, let's wrap with the division favorite, the Buffalo Bills. Interesting offseason, a lot of change, a lot of questions, a lot of departures. I think the most significant departure is the loss of Stephon Diggs. I'm less worried about the departures in the defense, which we will get to. The Diggs departure is interesting, Taylor, because obviously he was somewhat marginalized in this offense in the second half of last year. And I think marginalized is the correct word, because I don't think he was, he is undeniably on the downturn of his career. He is a wide receiver in his 30s. That is what happens. But he's still a very, very good wide receiver who I will talk about when we get to the Texans, but one who Joe Brady just didn't want to use as much. He was often out there as like a bit of a decoy at times. They had him ISO'd. He was running a lot of screens and deep routes, and was used less over the middle of the field in that intermediate area where he's cooked. So I think the biggest question I have about this Bills offense is one that has kind of already been partially answered because we saw it in the second half of the season, which is, what do they look like without Stephon Diggs? How do you replicate Stephon Diggs' production?
So it's tough by committee for sure. I don't think it's going to be one guy. This is an offense where I think who is going to be getting the majority of the targets, like obviously Dalton Kincaid. Like this is now, I think, his passing game. Things are going to run through him. Also Keon Coleman, obviously. Although I wonder how they're going to use him, just because they don't have a Stephon Diggs where you really feel comfortable isolating him and having him one-on-one. Like if you're talking about an X, Keon Coleman's as close as you get for guys that you expect to start. Like maybe Mac Hollins can go out there. I really like him, but I also don't love him ISO'd. But our buddy Anthony Prohaska of Cover One, he's mentioned a lot that they could just use more condensed formations, kind of like the Chiefs or the Rams or those teams that really have more Z slot types. You just bring them in so they have the two-way goes and they don't have to get in situations where they're getting pinned to the sideline by these more physical outside corners. So I think Josh is going to have to spread the wealth. Also, I think the quick game, maybe a little uptick in that, rely on these guys after the catch a little bit more, which I think is a place they can thrive. Khalil Shakir as well. I really like what he could be, maybe a Cole Beasley type where he can actually separate and give you some effectiveness after the catch rather than being more of like a Gabe Davis-y type where you're kind of throwing it up and letting him eat. That's more Keon Coleman's role, I think. But yeah, replacing Stephon Diggs is not going to be easy, even the version that we saw last season, but it's really going to come down to Dalton Kincaid, I feel like, controlling the middle of the field and then just kind of dividing the touches and putting defenses in a place where they don't really know who to key in on.
Kincaid is the one that I am most optimistic about, especially early on, and perhaps most intrigued by in year 2, because in the second half of the season, you really saw him start to emerge. Greg and I talked about this a little bit in the X Factors pod. But, there were, obviously, Dawson Knox was injured at points during the season. So they didn't get to use as much 12 personnel as we thought that they would when they drafted Kincaid. But something that really stuck out to me, and I think is so important when we talk about how do you replace Stephon Diggs' production, what do you do when you face man coverage? That was Stephon Diggs, one of the best man-beating receivers in the NFL of the last 10 years, right? As a route runner, his ability to get open quickly and separate in his hands. And you saw in the second half of the season, Kincaid start to emerge as an answer to that as well. And I just pulled this out of curiosity after the coordinator change. When the Bills faced man coverage, Kincaid's target share jumped. He averaged more yards per route run versus man coverage than Stephon Diggs in that second part of the season. And his air yards per attempt took a massive leap from 5.8 to over 8 air yards per attempt. They were using him over the middle of the field, getting the matchup, getting favorable matchups because of his position. And I feel like if that can continue and he can continue evolving as a reliable option, that's going to be so meaningful for this offense. I think Joe Brady, you mentioned the Chiefs and their condensed formations. I really think you want to borrow heavily from some of the things that they did to get Travis Kelce open versus those looks with bunches and, the way that they've used him in particular over the last few years when they go into their quads looks with the Kansas City Chiefs. I just feel like Dalton Kincaid can be used very similarly.
And even Rashee Rice, like they were just so good
Yeah.
at getting those guys open in the middle of the field and giving them opportunities where they thrive. And with Kincaid, he's a tweener and everyone's saying, oh, but where does he really fit? No, if you have a good offensive coordinator, you realize he gives you that, dynamic tight end mismatch problem where if you want to defend him with a slot corner, that guy could be all over him, but he's bigger than that guy and he could probably box him out. Unless you have a real freak safety who has crazy movement skills and can really hang with him both in terms of his movement ability and size, you're kind of screwed. Most strong safeties cannot hang with Dalton Kincaid in man-to-man coverage. So he can provide some really difficult mismatch situations. And then when you're looking at zone coverage, I feel like every year he and Josh Allen are just going to get more in sync. You talk about Travis Kelce. The reason he and Mahomes are impossible to defend is because they are just so in sync and they always know how to beat whatever coverage is handed. And Mahomes can throw with anticipation, knowing where Kelce's going to go. And I feel like that's going to be Josh Allen and Dalton Kincaid's relationship over the years. We'll probably see that more this season as, he becomes that number one threat in their offense or their passing game.
What did you make of what we saw in the second half of the season from Joe Brady? So like the big, I've talked about this a little bit, big difference. Obviously the most notable difference outside of Diggs being somewhat marginalized was not just the ability to run the ball. They were as good running the ball under Ken Dorsey, but the willingness to do so, I would say they went from being one of the offenses in the NFL least likely to run the ball to one of the offenses most likely facing, with situation and formation. That was the biggest change. Otherwise, from efficiency perspective, it's not like they had this like boom. It was a good offense before. It was a good offense after. So was there anything you saw from that offense that you liked, didn't like, and do you have any expectations or perhaps desires from this offense? Like, is there anything you think they can do to continue improving next year under Brady?
I do like the way they stacked plays together. I felt like that was definitely an improvement and one of the reasons they moved the ball more effectively. One thing I would like to see more, though, is truly relying on the run game. Like the Bills becoming a run-first team, I don't think is a problem. If anything, whenever the Patriots are playing the Bills, my biggest worry is for them to actually commit to the run. So you have no idea when you get that, Josh Allen, you got 8 guys blocking and you only have a couple guys that are actually running downfield. That's where I think this offense is the scariest because James Cook is, I think, the second best player on this offense. He's someone you actually have to account for. Big play threat. He can actually be your true bell cow back. They've also, I think, did a good job with like Ray Davis getting some guys behind him so he doesn't necessarily have to be that every down guy getting all the carries. But if defenses are thinking we have to respect James Cook, that puts you in a really bad spot because, oh, look, Josh Allen's got the ball and he's throwing it over our heads. So
yes, well, that's what I'd like to see is that you saw that commitment to the run. I think the continued evolution of the run game, but also building the pass game off of that run game. When we think of the best, most efficient offenses in the NFL, like the San Francisco 49ers, the Baltimore Ravens, the Dolphins, honestly, like last year, the Rams, they were offenses that were able to do that and to really, really put compromised defenses because of how well they ran the ball. The Buffalo Bills are a great running team now. They're a great running team.
Do it in the red zone too. Like that's what committing to the run game really means for me. It's not just when it's convenient, like first down or second and manageable. It's no, in those situations where it is a critical situation, you can lean on your run game. And again, that just makes it with a guy like Josh Allen, I know you've done a great job touching on it, who is a threat to run himself. If you're scared of James Cook getting the ball, you mix in Josh Allen keepers, moving pockets, things like that. It doesn't have to be the Josh Allen show. And I think if Joe Brady truly embraces that and lets Josh Allen take a back seat when things are on schedule, third and long and everything, let Josh Allen do his super heroics, but don't put him in a position where he has to do it. That's where, again, I think if James Cook is one of the primary threats when it's on schedule, that makes them an absolute nightmare.
You alluded to this, but I do want to hit it before we wrap with the defense, which is the width of the formation. So the offenses I mentioned, the Rams, the Dolphins, the Niners, they have the Packers, most condensed formations in the NFL. Texans, that tree. The Bills have been one of the most spread teams in the league during the Josh Allen era, alongside teams like Philadelphia, right? Who do it well, who have been successful. But you mentioned that we might see that change a little bit, or you'd like to see that change a little bit. Can you speak to why? Because I think this is one of the more significant trends in football right now, and I think it's worth explaining to people how that can help an offense.
One, like we mentioned, they don't really have a true X. And I think, one, that's a hard thing to find. And I think offensive coordinators are embracing the fact that those guys are unicorns. The guy who you put outside the numbers and he can just live in that world and dominate. There's not a lot of guys who can do that, but it doesn't mean these receivers aren't talented. And that's one thing with Keon Coleman going to the Bills is I'm thinking, I really hope they don't pigeonhole this guy and make him have to do that. So I think with the personnel you have, especially with Coleman being a really good run blocker as well, getting him tight to the formation. If you want to have Dalton Kincaid is kind of more like a Z, or however you want to kind of mix up the offenses, I think you have that size advantage as well. So bringing those guys closer to the formation, I think, gives you more options in the run game. But also, it just allows your offensive or your receivers to have more room to work. You get the two-way goes, so defensive backs don't really know where you're going. Sometimes that forces some defenses to play off coverage where you don't have to worry about press all the time. And if those guys do decide to press you and they miss, you have so much more field to work with. And also, again, Anthony did a great job touching on this. It also adds more gaps to the run game, so it makes you more diverse there. So I'm glad the NFL's embracing it. I remember kind of growing up watching offenses. I'm like, why don't more people do this? Like, just make life a little bit easier on your receivers. You don't have to always be in a position where you have that one-way go and everyone knows kind of what's happening. So it just kind of gives your offense more options, but also, again, with an offense like this where everybody does better when they're inside the numbers and they have a little bit more freedom, I just think that's kind of the natural progression for this offense without a Stephon Diggs or a Gabe Davis.
Blocking receivers. Davis could block, but yeah. Okay. Defense, I had them, I think, 10th on my top 10. I kind of touched on this. I think the losses are not as, it's sort of a lot of names that people know that I think players who are, we talked about Poyer. I still think he can play. I just don't think he's not who he was a few years ago. Certainly Trey White hasn't been for them. He's been hurt. So aside from that, it's a pretty similar group. Matt Milano comes back. Terrell Bernard was excellent for them. The biggest change really is at safety with Taylor Rapp, who played a lot for them, by the way, last year, joined by Cole Bishop, who's a rookie, so he didn't play, and Mike Edwards. I think that's probably my biggest question mark, just because otherwise it's pretty much the same. That safety position, and then I think just, pass rush. Von Miller was so bad. I don't know. And he, I think, might have a suspension looming. I don't know what the latest is with him, but can you get another leap from some of the young players up front? I think is probably the biggest difference between this being a 10 to 15 defense versus a 5 to 10 defense in terms of the rankings.
I think so, just because I have a lot of trust in Sean McDermott as a defensive mind. Like,
Same.
It's really just in McDermott we trust. He has dealt with a lot of crap with aging players, guys who are injured in and out of the lineup, and he still manages to make it work. So I'm never going to count him out. I have heard Kyer Elam was looking pretty good this spring, so he's a guy that I really like. It seems like they haven't really meshed super well. So if he can enter the scheme, I think that's going to be huge. Terrell Bernard that dude could be a serious problem if he takes a step forward. Obviously with Matt Milano coming back as well, that helps that second level a significant amount. Christian Bedford's a guy that I really like as well. And then, you already have the kind of veteran blocks on that defense. Like, again, Matt Milano, Teron Johnson, one of the best one of the best slot corners in the NFL, one of the best corners. I don't even want to disrespect him because slot corner is very difficult to play. I am curious what's going to happen with that safety position because it feels like they have a lot of strong safeties. And I know they play a ton of too high, and you can spend a lot
Yeah.
of time there, but you can't avoid single high looks either. So who kind of emerges there? Maybe that's Cole Bishop is the young guy that you're hoping doesn't take a step forward, I guess, because he's never played in the league, but could at least give you some good production because I'm just not sure who fits there.
Yeah, Rapp played free safety more than I expected, and a lot of that was discussed injuries, and I actually thought he was pretty decent in deep coverage in the latter part of the year. But I think of him more as a strong safety. He's a really physical player, which, by the way, there's some injury risk there. And Bishop, to me, it did feel a little duplicative. He kind of reminds me of him to some extent. As a so I think I said this already, but this to me is like the perfect Justin Simmons team. Just,
Yeah.
like
Honestly, I hope you didn't just put that into the universe and somebody's going to hear you. But I mean, that is literally a perfect fit. It takes a lot off Cole Bishop's play too, because then you can actually use him where he thrives rather than kind of forcing any one of these kind of square pegs into a round hole.
Connor Diggs too is still out there and is totally, very capable free safety. So I think that would be a position I still think Buffalo could add to because this is still a good defense and it is still, I believe, the favorite to win the division, which is where we will wrap by ranking the teams. It's so tricky with the Jets because of the whole if they're healthy caveat. If they're healthy, I am going Bills, Jets, Dolphins, Patriots. But it's a pretty big caveat.
Yeah, that's the exact same thing for me. If they get, we have to go on history to some degree. It's like the Bills are on top because, you got to unseat the king. And they've been the king for a long time. That is what it is. But the Jets are the Jets. I mean, talk about snake bit, man. I think it's irresponsible to assume that things are going to go their way. If they do, awesome, throw New York a bone. But it's just between Mike Williams and Aaron Rodgers. Again, I do like that you have some depth behind Tyron Smith, but at the same time, if Williams or Rodgers goes down, it feels like this offense is going to be in a really tough position. And even Breece Hall to a degree. I mean, you have the backups who can replace his carries, but not his impact. And there's just so many ifs. And they have that on the Dolphins as well. We talked about the offensive line. That's huge. And the Jets, I think, even if something happens, they have a better depth and starting unit on that O-line. But yeah, if we're talking health, Jets too, and I don't really think twice about it. But if you just tell me like, no, but you can't assume health, I got to put the Dolphins at 2. And of course, the Patriots are in the basement for now.
I think 4.5 wins is really low for the England. Not really low, but I saw that and that felt low to me because of the defense. And also I like Drake May. I'm optimistic about him.
That's the thing. If it weren't for the defense, I would understand. But this is, I think, going to be
really good defense. Yeah,
it's a really good defense. It's going to keep them in game. Like this is when I was on the show last year. My whole caveat for the Patriots doing well was the defense would keep them in games, and they would have to close out in the fourth quarter. I wasn't far off because they were in almost every fourth quarter they played. But
they dragged a lot of teams to hell. That's for sure.
Yeah. So, but yeah, for now we have to be responsible and keep them in the AFC East basement. But we'll see what happens if Drake May enters the lineup. That's where I think. If some of their young guys can actually be contributors, that's where I think they start getting into playoff contention, but we shall see.
I want them to trade Jacoby Brissett to the Raiders, but that's a different conversation. All right. I will do, as I've been doing, I will ask you for a recommendation for a piece of content, something you've been reading, watching, could be a movie, could be a game, could be an album, whatever your heart desires. Is there something, I know you watch a lot of stuff, Taylor, is there something that you have enjoyed as of late?
Well, I know Connor Rogers and Trey Sycamore are doing a great job with their summer scouting series. I'm not a huge college football guy until draft season, but they're kind of giving me a leg up so I actually know what's going to be happening going into the season. So I have a little more familiarity and it gets me a little more excited. So I would definitely recommend that. They always do a fantastic job. I think Trey Sycamore just had something come out kind of detailing his career, which is awesome. They're both so fantastic, but I would recommend that if you're looking for a way to kind of get excited about college football.
I love that. I'll have to. like those guys, so I'll have to check that out. For me, I just finished a book, The Stoned Home by Crystal Hannah Kim, who wrote If You Leave Me. It's about it's fiction, but it's based on something that really happened, which is these reform centers in South Korea that lasted until the 80s that were incredibly abusive and awful. And it's a tough read, I'm not gonna lie, but it has a really, really wonderful story at the heart of it. And I learned a lot, it's just for me a part of Korean history that I wasn't familiar with. So I enjoyed learning a little bit about that. I think next I'm starting The Immortal King Rao, which a lot of people have read. I've never read that book, but I have it saved up. So I'm excited to get to that. And I am excited that you came back on today to talk about the AFC East. This was a ton of fun. If you're listening to this and you like to watch it, which God bless you if you do both of those things, you can watch it, of course, at youtube.com/@MinaKimes. Please subscribe and anyways there, because we put out content other than the podcast as well. And we put a lot of my appearances on NFL Live, some of my commentary there too. So youtube.com/@MinaKimes. As always, you can listen to this wherever you get your pods. You can listen ad-free on Amazon Music. Thank you so much to the fine folks at Omaha Productions for helping me, as they always do. Kirsten Svecki, Anthony Jimenez, Owen Saylor, Jack Foster, Tucker Tashjian. And we will be back on Monday with another Power Hour podcast. First-time guest coming to your ears. And then after that, the NFC East.